Today on This Week in Space, we talk with space journalist Leonard David about China's space program.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode number 40, recorded December 9th, 2022, China in Space with Leonard David. Hello, and welcome to another episode of This Week in Space, the China in Space edition. I'm Rod Pyle, editor-in-chief of Ad Astra Magazine, and as always, I'm joined by the unsurpassable Tariq Malik, editor-in-chief of Space.com. How are you today, Tariq?
I'm doing well. I think the adjectives get better every week, Rod, for me. I'm going to have to think of some good ones for you one of these days. So,
yeah, they're actually beginning to get, like, not in the Webster Dictionary, but that's just how I roll. And we're here today, once again, with our good fortune, with premier space reporter and journalist Leonard David to discuss China. Welcome back, Leonard. Thank you for joining us.
Well, great. Thanks for having me again. Appreciate it.
Oh, we'll have you again and again because you're a vast pool of free knowledge for us. So before we embark on this week's adventure, yes, just as you feared, a joke. This time from listener Chris Clark. Hey, Tariq, why haven't aliens come to our solar system yet?
Why haven't aliens come to our solar system yet? Was it something I said, Rod? I hope not.
It's because they read the reviews, just 1 star. That's kind of a repeat, actually. We did something like that a while ago, but Chris sent it in, and I thought it was a good one, and he rephrased it in such a way that made it applicable. And as always, of course, we're scouting your best lame space jokes. Give us your best shot at twis@twit.tv. That's TWIS at twit.tv. Each week, we'll pick 1 or 2 of the best ones and read them on the air with credit to you. And all we ask of you is to subscribe and review us on your favorite podcatcher. All right, we got a bunch of interesting headlines this week, so let's get right at it. To the moon, Tim. That's a reference back to the 50s for those of you who are old enough. Yusaku Maezawa, who a few years back made headlines by commissioning a flight around the moon on Elon Musk's Starship, which isn't actually flying into orbit yet, but they're working on it, announced that he picked 8 of his new closest friends, new traveling companions, to go to the moon. And in space-worthy news for those of us who follow that industry, of course, a gentleman named Tim Dodd, otherwise known as the Everyday Astronaut and a major media figure in space stuff, is going to go along. And I'll just add, before I turn this over to Tariq for comment, that for those of you who are hopeful, Yusaku's Moon Girlfriend project, in which he opened up online submissions for a woman to be his, I guess, lunar consort, was scrapped in January. So sorry that's done. Tariq, are you envious?
Well, I'm always envious of people that get to go to space because I don't get to, and I just think that that's very frustrating. But this is really interesting because back in 2018, Japanese billionaire Yusaku Maezawa, he is the founder of a clothing line and businesses and whatnot around the world, announced, with Elon Musk and SpaceX that he had bought this trip around the moon on Starship. And back then, of course, there wasn't even like any prototypes that SpaceX had built. They've said that they've built over 20 of them now for testing and engines. And now we finally know who's going. And, as you mentioned, Maezawa did launch a girlfriend in space contest initially, and then they kind of backed off that because it wasn't received quite as well as perhaps he might have hoped. And they came back with this crew concept, where he's going to take 8 people with him. And there was a very intricate application scheme a couple of years ago when they announced it, and where you had to apply through video, your stuff had to go viral, you had to kind of show what you were going to do and your passion for it. And now we know who these 8 people are with the Dear Moon crew. Now, this was just announced a day before we recorded this episode. It just kind of came down late in the week. But Maezawa is going to be taking Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. He's a photographer turned YouTuber who is really into everything space, but more primarily everything SpaceX. He's kind of made a name for himself, getting access to Elon Musk and moving to South Texas, where he's got a whole setup where they track all of the tests, but also the major launch events as they come out. But you also have some other folks who are going too. Steve Aoki, I hope I pronounced that correctly, a DJ and producer of electronic dance music, Yemi AD, an artist and choreographer with the I think I'm pronouncing JAD dance company. Kareem Elia, a photographer who has worked with the National Geographic magazine, among others. Rhiannon Adam, a photographer who has worked with the BBC Royal Geographical Society and award-winning photographer there. Brandon Hill, a filmmaker and documentarian, so you can expect some good video to come out of this mission. Dev Joshi, an Indian TV actor who portrayed the role of Bal Veer in the Bal Veer and Bal Veer Returns films, and T.O.P., a South Korean rapper. And then there's some backups as well. The dancer Miu and the Olympic gold medal winner snowboarder Caitlin Farrington. So a really rounded out set of folks that are going on this. Of course, the space reporters and space fans might recognize Tim Dodd a little bit more among all of those. And he is really excited. He said he was literally over the moon that he was going to the moon when the announcement was made. But it seems like now things are getting a little bit more real. Now, SpaceX has not had a test, like an actual flight test of a Starship in a number of months, been over a year, as they've been kind of going back and forth with the FAA over like launch licenses and whatnot. And of course, they're testing both the Starship and the booster that they need, the Super Heavy, ramping up engine tests where they're adding more and more engines. That first booster is going to have 33 engines on it, and they all need to work together correctly to get the Starship vehicle itself into orbit. And that we're still hoping that SpaceX might get that first uncrewed orbital flight test where they're going to launch the Starship into orbit, bring the booster back, and then I guess dump the prototype into the ocean off the coast of Maui just to show they can do it by the end of the year. But, we haven't heard a lot. They haven't really gotten to the 33 engine test stage yet. I think they were at 17 or so at the last count. Still a lot of engines, but they're only halfway there.
So just want to point out that story came from space.com, and I covered the unveiling of this particular project for you, Tariq, down at SpaceX, I think 2018, whenever the announcement was, which was kind of interesting. So they packed the press into a little cattle corral in one of their south buildings in Hawthorne. So we were jammed in there shoulder to shoulder and cheek to cheek shooting the event. And Yusaku came out, and I actually knew him vaguely because I shot his first rock video back in, 2003 or something for his Zozo clothing line in the US. Interestingly, that didn't get me any leverage whatsoever in getting on the flight. I guess if I had applied, that might have helped. But Yusaku came out. He's very small. He's a very compact man. He's short, maybe 5'3" or something. And so he was standing there, and there were so many SpaceX employees jammed down in front of us, to make for a better shot, I guess. We couldn't see him. So Elon, in what was at least then kind of characteristic moment, grabbed him and hoisted him up and hosted the rest of the press conference with Yusaku on his shoulders. So that was kind of weird, but I guess it's kind of cute.
And it's interesting, a lot of things have happened about this mission since then. SpaceX soon after announced they were going to build Starship in the Los Angeles port. Now they're not doing that anymore. They're doing all of their testing at their Boca Chica Starbase facility. They're halfway through building a second launch site at the Kennedy Space Center, really close to the Pad 39A where they launched Falcon 9s and the Crew Dragon missions. In the meantime, Yusaku Maezawa did not want to wait for at that time, this is back in 2018, a 2023 launch date to go around the moon. He has flown to the International Space Station, and he paid to have a videographer go with him. And this is in December of 2021. So he's already gotten a taste of what a flight would be like for an extended period of time. He was up there for about a week and a half or so, and he had you can see all of his exploits and all of his experiments and the weird experiences that he tested out. He actually had fun up there as opposed to doing a lot of like intricate science and stuff for that flight.
All right. Well, that's very good. Leonard, would you go if you had gotten the nod?
No. No.
First beyond Earth orbit flight, or possibly second. I suppose they'll do it unmanned loop first. All right. Well, enough about that. Let's move on to other moon news. This from Space News and Space.com. Artemis 1 is returning from deep space this week. And now the big question is the heat shield. That heat shield's coming back at higher speeds than that capsule's been tested. This is only its second flight. First one was in 2014, and it did a high-speed plunging return, but not at this speed or these temperatures. So while there's still a lot of other steps to go through, the big one is the heat shield. Tariq, what do you know?
Yep. That's right. So mark your calendars. If you're an early riser or a nice Sunday bruncher on December 11th, so that's Sunday coming up as we're recording this episode, NASA's Artemis 1 Orion spacecraft will return to Earth. It's kind of locked in now. If everything goes right, around 12:40 p.m. Eastern time, so 9:40 in the morning, it's going to re-enter and splash down about 300 miles south of I believe San Diego, in the Pacific Ocean. There's a Navy ship that is waiting to recover it. And so far, everything's been going pretty well. I mean, we've talked a lot about this mission, and I know in a previous episode we went really deep into it with astronaut Doug Hurley, which was a really big treat. But it seems like NASA says that everything right now is working fine. They've had some power hiccups on the spacecraft where some switches are commanded open when they're not really supposed to, or some of them have shut down. They lost contact briefly with the spacecraft as it was approaching its return trip from the moon. Both of those things, they think they can figure it out later, but they haven't really impacted the mission very much. And it does all come down to that heat shield, 16.5 feet, the biggest heat shield of its kind, slamming into the Earth's atmosphere at a mind-boggling speed where it's going to heat up, I think, about half the heat of the sun, half as hot as the sun, something crazy like that. And, you know, eagle-memoried listeners may recall that NASA did launch an earlier version of Orion on the EFT-1 flight several years ago. Was that 2017 now? Something like that?
2014.
Oh my God, it was so long ago.
Yeah,
that's right, on a Delta IV Heavy. That's right. And so they did try to get as harsh a profile for return as they could at that point, but it's nothing compared to what they're getting now on this return from the moon trajectory. They're going to try something really new with this reentry, where instead of just barreling straight through the Earth's atmosphere and then parachuting down, they're going to try to kind of skip, like if you were skipping a stone on a pond or a lake, to kind of bounce off the atmosphere a bit and then settle back in, which would ease some of that space. So a way to slow down a little bit, so that when they re-enter the second time, that they'll be coming back at temperatures and speeds a little bit more familiar to astronauts, because they would be on the equivalent of what the space shuttle experienced on its ways back down. They don't know if that's going to work, but they're hoping that this will be a really viable way for them to shed some of that excess speed and velocity on the way back from the moon for crewed flights.
It's kind of a funny thing. Kind of a funny thing that happened to me yesterday. I got an email inviting me to Lockheed Martin over to a school to witness, because Lockheed Martin is kind of one of the main players in developing the heat shield. And in the memo, it says, come on, we invite the media. If you come, let us know. In the middle of it, of the memo, it says, in case something goes wrong, there will be no Lockheed Martin spokespeople available.
That's right.
Well, it's nice to have them let you know up front. I did want to point out with regard to this skip reentry procedure. It will divide. So besides reducing heating, which will still be about 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's hot. It does, as Tariq pointed out, it reduces the G loads on the astronauts. So instead of coming in, I think the Apollo flight's highest they ever reached was 7.5 or 8 Gs, which is a lot. If you've ever been subjected to a couple of Gs of force, getting up to 8 would be a big deal. This reduces it to 2 sessions of about 4 Gs. So it's a lot easier on the astronauts, and you don't have to be superhuman to survive it.
And I'll point out that this reentry, this is priority number 2 of the Artemis 1 mission, is making sure that the spacecraft can survive reentry. Priority number 1 was making sure the rocket doesn't blow up at launch, which they were able to do with SLS. And so in the hierarchy of test performance, this is the next highest thing that has to go right. And once it lands or splashes down in the ocean, NASA wants it to be really like what we see with Crew Dragon retrievers, where the astronauts land within like an hour, they're out of the spacecraft, they're on the recovery ship. They want to be able to be that fast with Orion 2, but they're going to leave the capsule in the ocean for at least an hour and a half, if not more, after it splashes down, because they want to see like, okay, what if we can't get to the crew right away? What's it going to be like inside the capsule for the astronauts? They've got all these sensors and everything, and they're going to be able to feed all of that into the other vehicles that they are still putting the finishing touches on in Florida. And eventually this capsule will get shipped over to the Kennedy Space Center, where they're going to pick it apart and learn from it and make any upgrades they need to for Artemis 2 in 2024.
Well,
yeah, correct me if I'm wrong here, and maybe Rod knows. It seems to me that Apollo had this capability of skipping, but they didn't use it. I'm not sure I misread something, but I think
you're right. They had discussed gliding reentry. I'm not sure if skipping is a little more ambitious than that, but gliding reentry was something that was looked at. I will point out also, just to add to the Tingler effect here, that the first test did show cracks on the heat shield. They weren't anything that was mission failure level, but they did have cracking. So that's something they're going to have to look at very carefully. And ultimately, the hope, at least at one point, was that the Orion capsule would be reusable. I doubt they'll reuse this one. At the rate that the program's moving, they may not end up reusing any, but there was some talk about that. Tariq, I'm going to let you pick the last story so we can move into the big chapter. So why don't you grab whichever one tickles your fancy?
Yeah, I just want to point out that in the really interesting mashup, SpaceX, and I know we were just talking about Starship, but SpaceX, which has made a name for itself with this brand new internet satellite constellation that it's been building with Starlink, and where they've got thousands of satellites in space now. They actually got just got a new approval to launch thousands more to make it an even more larger and more robust satellite constellation. But SpaceX launched this week their first mission for OneWeb. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because OneWeb is a direct satellite internet competitor with SpaceX and their Starlink. And OneWeb has bigger satellites. There's not as many of them. Their constellation is going to be about 600, 700 strong or so. But we watched just earlier this week. I think it was actually yesterday too. Yesterday was a very big day for space. They launched their first mission for OneWeb to help them get their constellation off the ground. OneWeb is targeting kind of more industry people, shipping and whatnot, and SpaceX is more kind of more commercial, users like yourself and myself, people in remote areas that need a more dependable connection. But it's just interesting that you've got this industry where two companies are facing down for the amount of bandwidth that they need to provide space-based internet. And yet SpaceX, which is, has its own interests, is now helping a potential competitor build up their infrastructure in space. Now, this all came out. It's all fallout from Russia's ongoing war on Ukraine, because Russia builds the Soyuz rockets that their partner Arianespace had then contracted and was the primary launcher for OneWeb satellites before the Russian invasion. And then a lot of companies and countries stopped cooperating with Russia. Russia said that at the time they were actually going to launch a batch of OneWeb satellites. They said they were still committed to doing it. Then at the last minute, they said, no, we're not going to launch your satellites on our rockets. Arianespace lost that whole deal and had to find new rides now for the OneWeb, and the first batch launched actually on an Indian rocket. So OneWeb is now kind of splitting its its satellites on these different vehicles themselves. And so they've shown that they can still kind of keep going with this constellation. They're now 80% complete with their constellation right now. SpaceX still has tens of thousands more to go to finish theirs, but both are still, they're being used now. They're in action, and it's really weird to watch the satellites deploy from SpaceX because it looks like a giant space corn cob where these satellite kernels are popping off over time. And I just thought it was a really striking thing. And there was a scene just from the very end of SpaceX's webcast, which everyone should check out because it was gorgeous. It launched at sunset from Florida. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what those exhaust images will look like. But they had complete camera views from the ground of stage separation of the first stage coming back to land. So SpaceX will use that again. But then you see at the very end, when the final satellite separates from the payload carrier, this little twinkling in the background. And those were all of the other OneWeb satellites that they had just deployed, like this big cloud already, just kind of like they had popped them all off in a bit of a cloud in space. So it's just interesting to see. I think it's worth mentioning because it was just one of the more picturesque launches I've seen this year through these webcasts themselves.
And that was also from space.com. And I think it's interesting, just as a final note on that one, this is another example of co-opetition in new space, which is a word now, I guess. First major case of that we saw was with Blue Origin supplying their soon-to-be, we hope, direct launch competitor United Launch Alliance with their engines for ULA's new Vulcan rocket, which was using Russian engines. So same problem as you discussed with the Soyuz launcher. And so by congressional mandate, had to move away from Russian engines. So Blue Origin started supplying them. So that's something kind of new. It's a little weird to those of us who have grown up watching this in a more traditional fashion, where aerospace contractors compete ferociously, this cooperative thing. But I like that. I mean, it shows that they can work together and still compete and be successful. All right, Leonard, you're back. Yeah. I just want to remind people that you've been doing space journalism for about 120 years. Actually, I think just 50. And DC was your beat for decades, and you're the guy. That's why you're here, because you know these things. And
a lot of people out there writing. A lot of people out there writing. And great, reporting going on now, and with all the bloggers and the Twitter and Facebooks, it's an incredible resource. Fantastic.
It's true, but don't be too humble. You're still the godfather.
Well, I'm getting old, that's for sure. And
okay, the grandfather.
But it's all happening, and it actually reminds me of younger days. That's for sure. There's just so much activity, and that to me is just great to be 76 now and see this really kind of an emergence of capability across the globe. And then, as Tariq was saying about the private sector coming on, and we got artists going up and all kinds of interesting people to communicate back to Earth what it's like to be out there. So it's a wonderful time. We've all been beaten up getting here. I mean, trying to report all this stuff and how it unfolds, and failures and all the other problems. But wow, it's a fantastic time.
It is. So speaking of fantastic time, China, which just in the last couple of years was able to launch their first modular space station. They had launched a couple of Skylab style, much smaller than Skylab, but Skylab style efforts before. Now with the new Tiangong space station, they are adding a module, which was not something, at least that we had heard about mentioned formally before. So it felt like kind of an add-on. Hey, we're going to add another unit to our space station to increase capability. And there was something about adding the ability to train for their lunar cruise, which of course gets a lot of people in the American Congress a little nervous, because we are still feeling competitive and a little bit, what's the word I want? Like exclusive about the moon, since we went there over 50 years ago. with astronauts. What do you think about this new capability? Now, I hope this one is able to be deorbited in an organized fashion when they choose to do so, because they haven't been real good about planned deorbits. But tell us about the new capability at the space station, what they're achieving up there that might be different from ISS.
I don't know if it's the difference. People think, well, how many experiments can they cram in that thing? It's about a fifth the size of the space station, of the International Station. I don't know. To me, it's a space race. I get a lot of emails when I say that, but I think we're in a space race, and this reminds me a lot of the Soviet Union and the United States, and the emergence of competition with political and diplomatic oars out in the water. And so China, I guess the answer is, I'm not sure, it's going to be the greatest space station ever developed. On the other hand, this modularity is a new thing to add on to what they're doing. So how do I know how big the thing could get? And how successful they're going to be with their experiments. And the other thing to watch is the diplomatic ability of China to bring on other countries and have it be sort of a mini international facility, with a lot of coming and going of other country experiments. I'd like to see the U.S. on there. So anyway, it's a capability. They're moving out. I think it's a space race, and when you take the whole total package of what China is projecting to do and has already accomplished in a fairly short period of time, got to keep your eye on their progress.
Yeah, I think I would just add that I think for when it comes to the Tiangong space station, so China added I'm going to get these name pronunciations wrong, and I do apologize, the Wentian and the Mengxian modules to the station. So now it looks like a T, right, Leonard? It's like a T-shaped structure, and they've hinted that they could keep going. And I would just point out that it's new compared to the International Space Station, which is, which may last to 2030, but then, is kind of it's been around for over 20 years. So that is kind of another, just being kind of a baby space station in terms of age gives them a bit more flexibility with what they can do with it, because they'll still have it. When NASA might have to try to be looking for replacements and new partners for something else after the station finally wears out.
Yeah, I think one thing people don't pay attention to, I try to, but it's not that easy. You got to look at the people behind their program. A lot of younger talent there, and you forget that this whole adventure of China is training a lot of people to do very complicated high-tech things, and not only for human spaceflight, but for robotic lunar exploration in particular, in Mars. And they're going to go off and bring samples back from asteroids. So, they've got
let me ask you about that, Leonard. Let me ask you, because the space station may be one of the more visible results of China's space exploration, but it goes back like a lot longer than I thought in terms of like its history. I mean, it's not a young program, although the crewed flights have been fairly recent in the last decade and a half or so. Can you kind of go back to like what was the origins? Because China's space program comes out of the military, and there's a lot of really close ties there, much closer than where we see the military ties maybe now with NASA on at least the public affairs side, where they try to really kind of keep its civilian agency roots on up and center. But for China, that military thing, that's right. For China, the military kind of links are really close there, right? I mean, what's like a snapshot of the evolution of China's space agency from, I guess, when they didn't have anything to now they've got a permanent station with people on rotation and whatnot in space?
Well, all I've ever seen is more and more universities involved. I've seen a lot of facilities being built. They're brand new. It's a pretty sweeping program. And yeah, it has military ties. And that's why the Space Force of the U.S. is very nervous about their capabilities that they are demonstrating. They can be used for anti-satellite efforts or blinding satellites or whatever, we should get into that more because I've got an axe to grind there about that problem.
Yeah.
Their first satellite, I think, was 1970 or something like that.
Yeah.
So, it's progressed. It's gone forward. They've gotten a lot bolder. The pace of capability is picking up. It used to be long spans of time between flights with a pilot of a cruise. Now they're talking about 2 human space flights per year, starting next year, to keep crews on board the space station for 6 month increments. So it's I'm not going to go through a whole historical thing about it. To me, it's just watch this space. I mean, they're going to be bold. They're going to be. They will have problems. They have a rescue vehicle on the pad now to rescue the Shenzhou astronauts that are up there in the station. I think that's something we should go back and revisit if needed. Yeah, if something goes wrong. So the program is really exciting. I'd like to see a lot more. Well, we'll get into all that, but there is room for cooperation. And again, it mirrors to me my early years of space race where Russia was hated. They got problems, with the people and communism and whatever, we were tossing around at the time. And it feels the same with China. And I think there's windows of opportunity there that we ought to really work together.
Well, and interestingly, sort of taking an opposite look at it, there's also a window of opportunity, which we saw during the Trump administration, to beat the drums of competition and say, hey, China's catching up. We've got to speed up and move ahead because this really is a race, both on the military and civilian side. Just a little bit of a backgrounder. A lot of people don't know China started their space program about the same time the U.S. and the Soviet Union got going back in the 1950s. And it really picked up some speed, at least in terms of design and intent, when a gentleman in the United States, Chinese guy named Quan Yushen, I think I've got that right, who was a product of MIT and was working at Caltech, got booted from the Caltech faculty during one of the Red Scares because he felt to have communist sympathies. He was going to be sent home, but he was detained at Terminal Island in Los Angeles Harbor for 5 years during this whole thing. Then eventually sent back to China and became the so-called father of rocketry there, helping develop weapons and missiles, nuclear missiles and satellites and so forth. And as you said, they had their first satellite flight in 1970. They didn't start the human spaceflight program until 1992, and then had their first launch in, I think it was in 2003 in a modified Soyuz. So they basically licensed the Russian spacecraft that was designed to race us to the moon. That was designed back in the mid 1960s, licensed it, improved it a fair amount, changed a lot of things on it. And that's been the backbone of their program ever since. Now they're designing a new crew capsule, as is the Soviet Union, and as we have, Russia, and as we have with the Orion. So it's weird. On the one hand, you look at it and go, wow, it took them a long time to get where they are. And a few years back, you could look at the Chinese human spaceflight program and say, well, they're up to Gemini, right? They've got spacecraft in orbit with multiple taikonauts/astronauts and so forth. But then this jump to the space station, which is a far cry beyond what Skylab was. So a lot of fast progress, possibly some appropriation of intellectual property, which is another topic. Perhaps we won't have time to get into it too much today, but we do see some recycled designs from things we've done, particularly as I'm watching their so-called civilian side progress with commercially developed launch vehicles, there's an awful lot of stuff that looks like things we're familiar with SpaceX and so forth. But another topic. So years of struggle. There's one
commercial suborbital spacecraft concept that looks like the Blue Origin's New Shepard got like smushed with with a SpaceX Falcon 9 with the vanes and the landing legs and like the capsule with the pusher system. It's interesting to watch to see if those actually do get developed. So
yeah, and there's a lot of them. And again, as you kind of pointed out earlier, Tariq, some uncertainty about what the depth of the ties are between the military and the commercial side, because the program is still primarily a military run program. So, it's a little different than what we're used to. And as Leonard was pointing out, cooperation would be great. This is something Buzz Aldrin talks a lot, and both Leonard and I have worked with Buzz a fair amount. And it's a laudable goal, but we have a couple of problems. One is the ITAR regulations and the Wolf Amendment, which basically say that, if you're U.S. government and or NASA, it's very hard to work with China and other people on that kind of most dreaded list. And even if you talk to people at NASA, they have to kind of hint around certain subjects when they're talking to people in Canada who are working on the Canada arm or something. It's like, well, we can't talk about this directly. We have to be a little careful. So that's a big constraint. And then there's just the idea that you're working with somebody that's potentially going to be a competitor in this realm. So, why don't we jump into that for a second before we talk about some of the robotic achievements, Leonard? You were talking about cooperation. Talking to people at NASA that I've spoken to felt that if it was to evolve, it would not be surprising to them that it might go similar to how it did between the U.S. and the USSR, which is, of course, in 1975, we had the cooperative flight between Apollo and Soyuz with astronauts and cosmonauts. But about a decade before that, we started cooperating first on the robotic side, where the stakes were lower, very quietly, between our two robotic programs to the moon and other places. They didn't succeed at Mars, but to the moon and Venus, excuse me. How do you think that might play out?
Oh, well, I'm trying to make notes here, what you're talking about.
Sorry, put a lot in that one.
Yeah. I think the room for cooperation, again, I was there in DC for Apollo Soyuz, and, Proxmire was up there and was convinced that we're going to lose all our docking technology somehow to the Russians. And that was a big deal. He was really mortified that we were working with Russia. And now today, it's sort of a common thing. So I see that mirror again today. I see that with China, with all the human rights violations and all the things that get brought up. I think you're right, Rod, about you're finding avenues that you might be able to work with would be climate, some other kind of space science research activities where it's a common bond of, understanding the Earth. So maybe that's a window that we can start moving more. My understanding from some people that don't want to get quoted, I think there is something in the works for trying to get some samples, lunar samples from China on agreement, and that would be a plus for a lot of people hungry to analyze what the Chinese have been able to bring back from the moon with a Chang'e 5 return sample. They did that thing spectacular. They returned samples from the moon. The Soviet Union had done it, many, many, many years ago, and that was the last of it. So anyway, China has all the samples, and maybe that's a inroad there to look for cooperation.
And is that when Leonard, when you say that there is kind of this space race with China going on, because Bill Nelson, the chief of NASA, he has said this on Capitol Hill in budget discussions. He said it during the last round that there was this competition pretty overtly. But is it this clout then that like, is that what the race really is? Because China was really wowed everyone with Chang'e 5 and how successful that, they landed, they got the samples, it lifted off, they did the rendezvous and the transfer, and it came back perfectly. And everyone wants to know if they can get a piece of that for the science aspect now. And we've seen like Russia team up with China and Europe for its Mars 500, where they had representatives of astronauts or astronaut proxies on those simulation missions, with an increase now of cooperation that is outside of like the space station 15 nation partnerships that we've seen in the past. And I had read, and this is a little bit more closer to home, that China is training potential astronauts for Pakistan. My father is from Pakistan, so that's really exciting to know about that. And so is that what the race is now, or is it more like that Cold War era where, we're going to get to the moon first and do the other things? Or I guess in this case, it would be getting those samples from Mars there. I mean, it seems like there's kind of a dual aspect of it now with this kind of iteration than what we saw more starkly in Us Versus Them Cold War era type of competition.
Well, I would think that what a scenario is that China really is highly successful with a lot of firsts, or getting back and doing things that we've not done. How that plays up on Capitol Hill, that's a good question, because I think you can use that as a space race tool. Oh, they're doing that. Why aren't we? Where's ours? What happened? And then you get into big discussions and money may come out of the system. Or you'll get people up there. Why don't we start cooperating with them? It's clear they've got capability, and we got holes in our own lunar science or whatever. So, it can go either way. I've seen it up on the Hill. I don't know how many hearings I went to. The thing I learned out of going to hearings is why doesn't anybody listen?
There's an irony there, huh? It's a hearing, gentlemen.
Yeah. Well, anyway, there's another side story to that. When you go into the hearing on the House side, there are words of wisdom on above the people sitting there. It's I don't know I can't remember what phrase it is, but something. And I kept looking at that. If anybody needs it more, it's them. They should have those words on the other side of the wall. Anyway, that's 30 years of going to DC and going to hearings. I've lost mine, and anyway.
Well, so continuing on this topic of cooperation.
Yeah.
You could see where, because both China and the U.S. and allegedly Russia, but we'll see, they're not doing a whole lot, have kind of prioritized the South Lunar Pole as a place to go, ostensibly for water resources. We have the Artemis Accords, the Artemis missions plan to go there and set up human presence there, and probably a mining and processing facility for lunar water, which we've discussed a lot on this podcast. It's great to get water there to use for fuel and breathable air and drinking water and so forth, instead of shipping it up from Earth, which is very expensive. So a number of nations have signed up the Artemis Accords to join us in that. China was not invited. And so China and Russia set up an agreement about an outfit base called the International Lunar Research Station, which they have claimed that they're going to put together and do themselves. And they've invited international entities to come cooperate with them on that. So, is this going to be a legitimate competitive advantage for them? I mean, they have shown they can land on the far side of the moon, and there's now concern about who's going to get Mars samples back first. They're designing a mission that's a lot more streamlined than ours. But to just talk about the ILRS for a minute, is that a real thing, or is this just saber rattling on their part?
Well, I don't know about saber rattling, but it's a joint idea that the Roscosmos and the Chinese have try to move forward. However, the China, they don't bring up Russia lately at all. They kind of talk about having a research station that their taikonauts could visit at certain times, but the Russian card seems to have fallen off. Maybe I'm overstating that, but at least that's the way I read it through the kind of websites I go to. So, but they're going to have a series of lunar robotic landers, China, and South Pole, and doing some drilling, and it's all great science. And meanwhile, the Russians can't get Luna 15 put together by Lavochkin, one of the great premier groups in the Soviet Union, and they've been trying to get that Luna lander off the ground for a couple of years now, and they're now moving it into next year. So I'm not counting on the Russians anytime soon getting to the moon, but we'll see how it plays out. But meanwhile, China is doing a lot, and their success rate so far has been great. Again, one thing that's very hard to follow, and I do try, but some of it's over my head. It's when you go and look at the results of the Chang'e 5 lunar sample work, and how many people have gotten papers out of there, and how many people are putting in papers in really peer-reviewed journals around the world. It's significant. They're learning about the moon and finding things that we were not sure of, or had data that didn't agree with each other. So anyway, China, from a scientific viewpoint, is making some real first in research. And anyway.
Yeah, and one of those Chang'e landers, I think, grew the first plants on the moon, which was amazing in its own little terrarium. And even on the ground, I mean, China has built the largest radio telescope on Earth, bigger than the Arecibo dish that unfortunately we don't have anymore because it collapsed. It was due to infrastructure issues. But
that, which is another term for
astronomy.
Neglect.
The astronomy side of this is good. And, I did want to ask Leonard, because you kind of mentioned or hinted at it earlier, that about the orbital uses that China has really exploded into. And I say that, I refer to it as that because they've done kind of two different things. Number one, from my count, China has more or has done more on the quantum satellite front for communications tests and whatnot and infrastructure than that I've seen any other country do so far, although some are coming up. And then, of course, we all know, or I hope that everyone knows, that China's been very liberal with anti-satellite tests and technology. They destroyed their Fengyan 1C weather satellite back in, what was that? Was that 2016? Is that about right? Or 2014? Creating the huge debris a huge cloud of debris that is still plaguing us every now and then to this day. And they haven't stopped, right? On their anti-satellite testing and maneuvers, as well as, they've got their own space plane that they may or may not been launching for that rivals the X-37B. What's going on kind of in that area that is why the Space Force is so concerned?
Well, from the Space Force side, I would think they think it's a space race. They can get more money, and they can, try to declassify what they know that China is doing that could be militarily useful in space. So, my axe to grind on that is, again, I'm getting old and I'm a retired peacenik. This is a cog in the wheel we keep seeing coming through all the time. Both countries goad each other by testing certain things, and we're looking for their response here. And China looks for what the Space Force is doing. So it's just a cycle. And, meanwhile, these peaceful uses of outer space get drug out. And, everybody claims that that's and sustainability. And there's a bunch of cliche words that are attached now to how precious space is. And so I guess what I'm getting to is that we're in a really interesting time with military use of space, not only the U.S., but everybody. And it's just one more potential glitch and got you that can escalate into something more severe. Mm-hmm. As we've seen in every other environment, air, land, sea, polar, deserts. I mean, this is, we're seeing the same thing evolve into space, and very few people seem to be caring about that situation.
So I appreciate and kind of agree with that point of view, although when I look at China and India to a point, but we're talking about China, I see a country that, even when I read their white papers, because, as a journalist or a book author in my case, getting a conversation going with their space entities is pretty much impossible. We've talked about that offline. But when you read their white papers, there's a lot of very lofty and frankly just outright nationalistic language going on. It's like looking at newsreels from the 1960s about what was going on with Project Apollo, and sometimes even beyond that. So the Chinese are really
you're talking about the Space Force or China?
No, I'm talking about China. There's a little bit of that Space Force, but compared to China, we're well, but I mean, we're propaganda amateurs in comparison. And I think China's done something very clever, beyond talking about, this will raise up the national character, it'll make us stronger. And there is this, and I have this in my house because my partner's Chinese. We talk about this. There's this notion of China's, was under the boot of colonialism for some time in the city of Shanghai. And, the 19th, 20th centuries were not a good time there in terms of international relations. And there is this kind of "we'll show you" idea that emerges. But beyond that, they've really wrapped the space program in almost kind of their mythological past. Everything's, when you look at the translations of the names of the spacecraft, the stations, it's Kingdom of Heaven, and they've wrapped the lunar program and the whole woman and rabbit on the moon myth. And it goes even deeper in terms of hooks in the national character. And I don't think this is casual. I think this is personally, I think this is deliberately designed to bring people along in sort of a form of soft power discussion. It's like, this is not just a program that's military/civilian, quote unquote. This is a national priority. And I'll just put it directly out there. Basically, we're going to war in space to prove what we can do. Do you think I'm miscontextualizing that?
Sure.
Go for it.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I don't think it's that dire. It seems too dire to me, but I know where I can feel your anchors there, and I know what you're talking about. But I just get back to something that I see happening, which is goading. Everybody goads the other competitor, and want to, and so we're ratcheting up capability in space, and there's classified things that God knows what's going on. I mean, if I can sit here and just do internet reading, what is really going on? You have to start thinking, what are the classified things that we're not aware of? And there's a lot. Both countries, or any country that's doing any kind of military enterprise up there. So, we're just seeing another environment go south, and we'll see. I'm very interested in what's happening with the Military Air Force Research Lab, in particular, looking at cislunar space and what worries they have at that distance, because now it's becoming, worrisome for Leo, MEO, GEO. Now let's get cislunar in there. So there's areas, Lagrange points that are going to be militarily valuable. So and if we have any kind of resources coming from these areas, then you get into protection of what's being processed, and it's setting itself up really nicely for the military mindset.
Well, and the whole freedom of navigation thing, which is huge with the American military, especially the Navy. There's been talk about that being an issue in cislunar space, which feels like a bit of a reach, but I suppose there's an argument there.
Yeah. Well, we'll watch the cislunar space. I think, well, I'm not going to go there, but
please do.
Well, no. Okay, I'll get off on a tangent. Anyway, I think we got to keep an eye on all the military activities in space, obviously, and that's what our Space Force is set up to do. And China has an aggressive program. Again, the hand waving peaceful uses of outer space, it turns into the useful pieces of outer space.
Yeah, I would kind of come up a little bit against your perspective there, Rod, about the nationalistic kind of. well, if I see the sense in rooting your space program to your public in the cultural history of your public, right? Because it's an anchor point to get people excited and tell them this is why you're doing it. There's a reason why Blue Origin's first spacecraft is called the New Shepard and not like the New Bezos. It's named after the first American in space. Their New Glenn rocket is named after the first American.
That's true, but it's not
orbit.
called. It's not called a Minuteman or a revolutionary of the American Republic. On the other hand, which
correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Apollo 17's orbiter or command module called the America, right? I mean, so and the Columbus, modules, those ships, they were
Columbia.
named after Columbia. So they were named after those.
They were named after real estate.
Oh well.
That's not saber rattling. That's national pride. I take your
wouldn't say
point.
That naming a moon lander after Chang'e, the moon goddess, I wouldn't say that's saber rattling either. So
no,
I wanted to bring that point up. So
yeah. Okay, so let me just be a little clearer. I'm not saying it's evil. I'm saying that I think it's very smart and a little cagey to wrap yourself in that much. Here we would wrap it in the flag, and we did. And there they're wrapping it in a distant national identity, which goes back thousands of years, and mandate of heaven and all that. I mean, that's a long discussion, but I want to get my last point in here, Leonard, which is kind of adjacent to this. Competition can be viewed as wasteful, although in the United States, given our past as a capitalist society and so forth, we kind of cherish it, at least in terms of business. But it seems like in the last 7 years, the very idea of a rising China has been, for better or worse, what got Space Force funded and over the hurdle. And indeed, it may very well be part of what assured the continuity between the Trump administration and Biden administration of not once again reversing the throttle on our space efforts and continuing to move forward, because we're feeling competitive and we're feeling some angst about, hey, we've already been to the moon and we're going back. You can't beat us there. I mean, do you think that there's something to be said for that competitive spirit? We seem to work best when we're challenged.
No, I agree. And I think when people divide up projects that were cooperative adventures between multiple countries, the costs go up. But, how do you put a price tag on diplomacy? How do you put a price tag on scientific wherewithal from multiple nations coming together to solve one problem? It's a tough call. I think maybe it was I don't know who said it, but, if we're working with them, they're not shooting at us, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I've heard that go by. And so, at the end of the day, it's going to be the achievements that every country racks up and bathes in the achievement. And I think I always go to the flip side, which is failure. And one thing that has to come about is it's not clear to me what the Chinese are using on their station for a docking adapter, and whether that's a common docking element that the U.S. could even attempt to rescue if something happened. So there is some commonality of hardware if we're going to move forward together in space that we should be trying to attain.
Can I ask, Leonard, what so we've seen in the last few years, so China has built their first full space station with Tiangong. They've landed on the far side of the moon with a rover for the first time and grown that first plant. They've launched their first mixed cruise with men and women working side by side on their space station. What's the next big first for China in space that you would expect to see in the next couple of years or so? Is it space tourism? Is it something new? What's out there that they haven't done yet that we're still waiting to see in terms of capabilities and whatnot?
I think a real clever thing that they're doing that the U.S. looked at but we didn't do is having a Hubble-like telescope go up and actually be upgraded and maintained by the space station. It can be brought in and actually worked on by the taikonauts. And so that's supposed to launch in a year or so, I think, this space telescope. So it's a big deal. Let me think. I think it's next year. By the end of the year, they should have that telescope up there. And it's huge, it's big, and they're bragging, this is going to do more than Hubble and blah, blah, blah. But so that's something to look for. But what I really like is the fact that they are going to position this telescope in a way that is far enough away for station effluence not to affect the optics of the telescope. But at some point, they can bring that thing in and have the taikonauts actually work on it. And that was an early idea that the International Space Station was considering for Hubble.
Wow.
So anyway, there you go.
I personally would be a little worried about bringing in something and working on it that's probably fueled with a hydrazine monopropellant, but more power to them. And I gotta give a nod, staying away from preference of political systems. China's been remarkably linear in their approach to this, which is something that we're challenged with here. And, they're getting a lot done in a short time, and hats off to them. And I hope we can eventually join forces. So Leonard, I want to thank you for joining us today. You'll be back, you okay. Hippie. And
yeah,
is your best web presence still at leonarddavid.com for us to check out what you're up to?
Last time I looked this morning, it's still up there.
Okay. And Tariq, where could people track your action-packed and exciting life?
Well, I am still on Twitter at Tariq J. Malik, and of course, always at space.com. And you may notice that today I am not at Rocket Lab's Electron launch from Virginia, their first ever U.S. launch. So next week, hopefully you can find me in Virginia for that first launch. Hopeful. It's going to be a nice long drive and hopefully a nice big launch.
And of course, you can always stalk me at pylebooks.com or at astromagazine.com, where my magazine Ad Astra lives. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, and sometimes Instagram. Please don't forget to drop us a line at your convenience at twis@twit.tv. That's TWIS at twit.tv. We always welcome your comments, suggestions, and ideas, and we answer all our emails. We love getting your comments. We publish new episodes of this show every Friday on your favorite podcatcher. And when you get there, please make sure to subscribe, tell your friends, give us a thumbs up, a lot of stars, whatever their metric is, because we love getting rave reviews. Who doesn't? And don't forget, you can get all the great programming on the TWiT network ad-free on Club TWiT, as well as some extras that are only available there, even some extras from this show, for just $7 a month, and you don't have to worry about any blue check marks. You can also follow the TWiT Tech Podcast Network at TWiT on Twitter and on Facebook, and twit.tv on Instagram. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Hey there, I'm Micah Sargent from TWiT, and you may be asking a question. What in the world do you do if you want to thank that hard-working team of yours? Well, why not gift them a Club TWiT corporate subscription? Oh, and here's a secret. You'll be benefiting yourself too, because you will be able to keep your team informed and entertained with podcasts covering the latest in tech, so you'll always stay up to date. With a Club TWiT subscription, they're going to get access to all of our podcasts ad-free. They'll get access to the members-only Discord server where they can chat with fellow Club TWiT members and all of us here at TWiT, and exclusive shows like Hands on Mac, Hands on Windows, and the Untitled Linux Show. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit and look for corporate plans for complete details.